This is Culture, Race, and Equity, a Chicago Urban League podcast. And right now, taking a seat at the table is attorney Paul Strauss. He's a civil rights attorney who focuses on employment discrimination cases. A graduate of Yale Law School, he was also a prior president of the Chicago Council of Lawyers and a finalist for the Trial Lawyer of the Year Award from the American Trial Lawyers Association Foundation. None other than Paul Strauss. Thank you for taking a seat at the table.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you.
No problem. Tell us a little bit more about your work.
Well, I've been in practice for 35 years. I concentrate on employment discrimination, class actions, and employment discrimination cases, and other types of civil rights cases. So I do race, sex, age, disability discrimination cases, mainly against private employers, but also sometimes against the government. These are cases in which people have been denied employment or discharged or denied promotions or have discrepancies in pay, all because of discriminatory reasons. At least that's what we need to prove in these cases. They're difficult to prove, but they are cases that are definitely worth bringing and important cases for us to do.
It's kind of difficult to prove these things in the court of public opinion, too.
Yeah, the court of public opinion is behind. There's been some very significant studies showing that there is race discrimination on a significant level, but they haven't penetrated the public sentiment as much as they should. There is tremendous white resistance to admitting to race discrimination, and the shocking statistic is that more white people, a majority of white people believe that white people are discriminated against more than people of color, which is crazy, but shows you what the public sentiment is.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because we're talking about racial wage discrimination right now. We can touch on gender wage discrimination as well. But I was reading an article not too long ago where I can't remember what the numbers were, but white Americans vastly felt that racial discrimination studies and disparities that people talk about were overstated.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw that study or if you just anecdotally already know that white people tend to not believe that.
Well, I know I've seen the study. What should be noticed is that there have been a couple of studies where resumes were sent out to employers with identifiable black names and identifiable white names, where all the information was otherwise the same, and black applicants got called back for interviews at significantly lower rates than white applicants, to the point at which it showed that a black applicant without a criminal record was likely to be called back at the same rate as a white applicant with a criminal record. So there's plenty of discrimination out there, and good evidence of it. There's also a very recent study that was described in the New York Times where black people or people with identifiable black names and people with identifiable white names contacted local government officials for information as simple as what their office hours were. And black people, or the people with black names, got responses at significantly lower, statistically significant lower rates than the people with white names. This kind of discrimination exists both among private employers and government employees.
What's the case that stands out to you?
A case that I enjoyed doing and that I thought was significant was a case involving black meat cutters who were employed by the A&P grocery store chain. A&P started closing stores in the Chicago area and laying off meat cutters, and they gerrymandered their seniority districts so that the black meat cutters were concentrated in a couple of districts, and you couldn't exercise your seniority outside of your district. The districts were gerrymandered so that the black employees were all in black area stores in a black area district, and they got laid off disproportionately, even though at the time A&P was hiring new meat cutters who were white in white area stores. So they got laid off even though they were more senior to the white meat cutters that were being hired. And we tried that case and won it, and won over $1 million in damages for the black meat cutters. And that, I thought that was significant just in how a company could manipulate its rules to harm black employees.
And this was in the 80s?
Yeah, that was in the 80s.
So what changes have you seen over the decades in terms of employment discrimination? Have you seen things get better? Have people been able to call you less?
I have seen things get better. I would say that the big employers are much more careful now to not get themselves in a situation where they can be sued for racial discrimination or sex discrimination. And that what we see now is many more cases by small employers who are not sophisticated and who sometimes are run by family members or run just without a lot of support from human resources or legal, and they do make engage in discriminatory actions. But I have seen changes by the major employers.
That's good to know. So where do we stand right now in terms of the racial wage gap in this country?
Well, there's a huge racial wage gap. You know, it goes back to slavery and Jim Crow and all the discrimination that's been evident in this country against black people and people of color. And there is a huge disparity in wages that and in wealth among black families as opposed to white families. And it's deeply ingrained both because of institutional racism and institutional problems in education and incarceration. And it's a significant problem.
Yeah, I was looking at a study that said among full and part-time workers in the U.S., blacks in 2015 earned just 75% of what their white counterparts make. You talked a bit about Jim Crow. I'm thinking about how do we get here? How did we get here? How do we get to the point where in 2015, the most recent study that I had a chance to look at from the Economic Policy Institute, how do we get to the point where we're still talking about these kinds of issues?
Well, I don't think you can discount the fact that centuries of discrimination against black people have put them at a disadvantage in terms of competing based on education and background. And then I think there's continuing discrimination that you can't discount that I've talked about. So it's a combination of factors. The historical discrimination that has affected education and training and access to jobs, and then the continuing discrimination that we have today. You know, access to jobs is crucial. You get employment a lot of the time based on who you know and who you have contacts with, and black people are at a disadvantage because they don't have those contacts as much as their white counterparts.
Mm-hmm. We spoken to someone who said the same thing. He was talking about how, you know, without citing the study that you mentioned about identifiable black names being on resumes and not getting called back as often as their white counterparts, you have people who say that there's a qualifications gap, which is why there is a racial wage gap. And there's some truth to that. If you look at educational disparities, even just in the state of Illinois, how high poverty districts don't get, you know, money funded toward primary school don't get the same resources as more wealthy school districts. Do you think the racial wage gap falls along qualification lines, or I guess the viability of people applying for these jobs to be qualified for the jobs that they're applying for?
Well, there is some factor of qualifications differences, but the studies that we talked about had people with the exact same qualifications on their resumes and blacks being rejected at much higher rates. So it's not simply a matter of qualifications. There's a discrimination component in there. And you find when you look at what happens to people once they're hired also that black employees do not progress at the same rate as whites, even when you control for things like education and training. So that there's definitely a qualifications aspect of things, but it's not the explainer of all the differences.
Absolutely. So how do you account for this? So do you legislate? Can you legislate this away?
Well, it's difficult. There is employment discrimination is prohibited by Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and by the Illinois Human Rights Act and the Chicago Discrimination Ordinance. But the way the cases are now with the burdens of proof and what you have to do, it's difficult to prove discrimination. I think that a major piece of legislation that should get passed would require employers to publicly report on a public website the numbers of people they hire for particular jobs broken down by race and sex, and publicly report the number of people they promote to jobs for particular jobs broken down by race and sex. And I think if you did that, employers would be embarrassed in the first place by their record and would make an effort to do better, and that it would show where there were significant racial disparities and allow those companies to be subject to lawsuits where it's appropriate. A lot of the problem you have right now is you just don't have knowledge of which companies are doing the wrong thing, and that public disclosure of information would go a long way to improving things. And I think that is one piece of legislation that could make a big difference.
You talked about the burden of proof. What makes it so hard to prove an employment discrimination case?
Well, let's say you take a typical discharge case, that a black employee says, I was discharged because of discrimination, and the reasons given by the employer were false. But the employer can typically come up in any case with some criticism of the employee and reasons why they were discharged. And then it's the employee's burden to have to prove that those reasons were false and that the real reason was discrimination. And that's just difficult to do. You have to get into the head of the decision maker and prove what their intent was. And you have to disprove that the reasons given by the employer were accurate. And like I said, an employer can always come up with reasons, some attendance or some matter of supposed poor production, or you put it this way, in any job you can see you could be subject to criticism for your performance, and disproving that that's the reason is just difficult to do, unless you have direct evidence of some racial slur or some really unusual pattern that you don't normally see. It's just very difficult.
Getting back to the issue of the wage gap, I can imagine it's difficult to, and I think this is why you see the reluctance on the part of whites to admit that racial disparity still exists, is because it's kind of hard to imagine a hiring manager saying, you know what, that's an African-American guy, love his qualifications, but I'm going to pay him 25% less than I pay this person. How does it really play out in practice where CEOs tend to pay black employees or women far less than they pay white male counterparts? How are they able to justify that?
Well, I don't think it happens at the CEO level. I think it happens much more at the managerial, mid-level management level. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they do justify it. I think they just do it. I have a case that I've just started where a black employee was hired and was paid 3/4 of the wage of the person he replaced and the people who were in comparable jobs. And I don't know that there is an explanation for that so far. The employer has responded by saying, well, let's engage in settlement talks. So it's an indication that they may not have an explanation for it either. But I think it's just done. And then employers rely on the fact that employees don't often know what the other people are being paid. And then if they do see a difference, it's always explained away by saying, oh, this other person had more experience, or a longer time at the company, or a better education, or there's some factor that they latch onto to try to give an explanation.
So if employers are already coming up with ways to just kind of explain away this, or I guess managerial level, they're coming to ways to explain this away, and legislating it is only a piece of the solution. What's the other piece of the solution? Is it possible to change the way people think?
Well, changing the way people think is difficult. And I think we are making progress, although obviously there's been a huge backlash with the election of Trump and the type of rhetoric he's engaged in has shown that there's been a big backlash. But there has been tremendous progress in the country over the last 50 years in changes in people's attitudes with respect to race. But it goes very deep, and it's not always conscious. Like I said, most white people will tell you that they are not biased against black people, but if you do tests, they will show that implicitly, at least, most white people do in fact view black people less favorably than white people, and I don't know how you change that attitude. The racial wage gap is due to all sorts of very, very, very deeply ingrained differences in educational opportunities and incarceration rates, and in the wealth gap between black families and white families. And it would require really a huge effort by government and private businesses to make that change. So it's not a matter that's going to be easy to deal with.
This is one of the most frustrating stats, Attorney Strauss. It says among four-year college graduates, people who have a college degree, adults aged 25 and older, 23% of blacks compared with 30, wait, let me see. Let me go back and read this correctly. I always do this every time I do stats. Hold on. It's talking about the wage gap, and it says that among those 25 years and older, 23% of blacks earn less than their counterparts, earn 25% less than their white counterparts, even though they still have these degrees. And I think, and I'll talk to you off camera, off mic, about talking to someone and kind of being frustrated in the fact that, anecdotally you can give examples of where someone who has the same education as their counterparts and still has that wage gap, and can go to their employer and say, listen, I know that person makes X, Y, Z, and I deserve a raise. And it can be explained away, and it just seems really difficult to address this in a real way. Like, everyone's not going to be able to call an Attorney Strauss to litigate this, and you also don't want to create a dust-up at the place that you work at. So what can black professionals do, really? What's something that you can really do?
It's very difficult. It is a concern about making a complaint and facing retaliation. I would say the most common complaint that I get that leads to litigation are people who have complained about racial discrimination and then been subject to retaliation in the workplace. So it's definitely a hard thing to do. If you have a explicit difference in wage rates for people who are equally qualified, the first step is to go to Human Resources and complain about it and see if you can get a remedy. In a well-run corporation, they should, and I think they sometimes will try to make a difference and try to correct that, but it's very difficult. I can't say I have a solution for that. It's a very difficult problem.
And just a few more questions. What do we say to small employers, mom and pop stores, who some business advocates would say should have the right to set wages at whatever they like to set them at?
Nobody has the right to set wages based on discrimination or based on race. And it's not a matter of saying you have the right to set wages where you want to. You have the right to set wages where you want to, but you have to treat black and white employees equally, and you can set your wages for a position, but where black and white employees have equal qualifications, you have to pay them equally, and it doesn't matter if you're a small employer or not. You've got to follow the law.
And what's one thing that we can do today to address this issue of this racial wage gap? Does it mean getting the word out? Does it mean more diversity training at companies? What does it mean? What can we do aside from championing the legislation you talked about earlier?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think one thing that would help would be to have better funding of the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission so that they can actually investigate cases and take in complaints and handle them. They are overburdened now and underfunded. And so people who file EEOC charges rarely get any significant action from the EEOC. So that would be one significant thing we can do. The legislation I mentioned, I think, is important to give out the information about what companies are actually doing. I'm not sure that bias training is really going to make a difference. There's some evidence that if you do implicit bias training or training on racial sensitivity, you actually may invoke white resentment and get more discrimination instead of less. Yeah, there's some evidence of that. I think changing attitudes, a lot of it has to do with media and media portrayal of African American people, and some steady progress we've made in how African Americans are viewed. Look, if you just look at interracial marriage has increased significantly. I'm married to an African American woman, and when we were married, it was a relatively rare occurrence, but it's interracial marriage rates have increased significantly, and people's approval of interracial marriage has increased significantly. So I think there is progress being made, but it's slow, and it's difficult to know how to increase it, how to move it faster.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I think as America becomes browner, and as your kids, you start to see these issues affect the people you love, your kids, your wife, your family, your extended family, becomes something that you start to pay attention to. We've seen it with the opioid epidemic. Just as when the crack epidemic was around, legislators couldn't identify with it, but you start seeing rich white kids deal with this opioid issue, and we start to see the government really try to fight that.
Yeah, it's a huge difference between how the government responded to drug problems when they seem to be focused on black Americans and how they've responded once drug problems hit white America. The difference is so stark and so significant.
So as our families become more metropolitan, we may see these differences in responses kind of into other sectors. At least we can hope so.
Yeah, we can hope so.
Culture, Race, and Equity, Chicago Urban League podcast. That is attorney Paul Strauss, civil rights attorney, focuses on employment discrimination cases. We're talking about the racial wage gap. Thank you for taking a seat at the table. I appreciate it.
I appreciate having the time. Thank you very much for having me.
No problem.